Hello my dears, and welcome to another Disability Dramaturgy Deep Dive. Sort of. Traditionally in the series, my spiel is that we break down shows that explicitly and or implicitly involve disability to academically demonstrate that disabled stories have always been a part of the media canon and always will be, work on our critical thinking media analysis skills, and talk about ways to more ethically stage and talk about these shows, always with a cool that happened, now what sort of mindset that lovingly pushes the industry forward and unpacks the fundamentally flawed system on which it was built. But this one sort of teeters more on like a, hey, what about those people situation, where sometimes I will go see a historical show or a movie or just like learn about something in history and wonder about disability in that time period or about a specific disabled person who's just like offhandedly mentioned, and then end up learning way too much information about that entire historical period so I can flesh out my understanding of people like me in history, because we're usually left out of history books. I've kept meaning to turn that into a video series. This has finally been the catalyst that will make that happen. I think the next project will probably be the suffragist movement, but if there's anything else, oh, there's also a historical figure I recently learned about with a disability that I thought was really interesting because nobody talks about it, so I want to do that as well. But if there's anything else that you want to learn about, let me know in the comments and I will add it to the list. But anyway, I went to see this musical called Floyd Collins earlier this month because the opinions on it have been just incredibly polarized and I was really curious. Also, with link ticks, you can see shows at Lincoln Center for $30 and $30 or $35, one of the two. And I haven't done an accessibility review of that specific theater yet, so I wanted to go and I was like, this is a win-win situation, it's gonna be great, whatever it is. And based on what I was hearing, I expected to dislike this show, but then there's a disabled character who's a real historical figure, and also the music is really interesting and intriguing to me and I couldn't stop thinking about it. So then I decided to learn more about who she was as a real person, and then just kind of descended into a hyperfixation at an alarming rate and fell in love with this silly little show, which leads us to here in this video. Also, in that vein, please forgive me in advance for all of the crunch of freak show and circus related disability content that's coming out later this summer. I had to move things around in order to make this video come out while the show was still running. Other quick housekeeping things before we get started. I'm gonna structure this like a typical dramaturgy deep dive, even though my commentary on the disability itself in the show is extremely minimal. Also, for friends who need it, I am a white young person with light brown shoulder length curly hair. I am wearing a cream colored button up with denim overalls on top, and I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. I should also mention on the content advisory side, if you're not familiar with this show, it is about a dude who gets trapped in a cave for 17 days and then does not live. So if that's a thing that freaks you out, this may not be the video for you, and that's fine. I have a playlist of other disability theater videos I will link above and below for you if you want to learn about this stuff and just don't like caves. I support you entirely. All right, so Floyd Collins as a musical first premiered as a commission at the American Music Theater Festival in Philadelphia in 1994, written by Adam Guettel and Tina Landau, and then opened off-Broadway at Playwrights Horizons on February 9th, 1996, where it ran until March 24th. This production won the Obie for Best Music, Lucille Lortel for Best Musical, and was nominated for 6 Drama Desks, winning for Sound Design. It has had a lot of productions in the UK and a handful of regional US productions, but it's not incredibly commonly done as best I understand it. I haven't been able to find a lot of records of this being common regionally. It's one of those shows that people often talk about with fond remembrance, but very few people have ever actually seen the show live. And some people do theorize that had the original production not opened off-Broadway within a couple weeks of Rent opening off-Broadway, it might have come out stronger in that season and thus maybe transferred to Broadway. I don't think we can ever really truly know that, and also it might have really struggled had it transferred to the Broadway at the time, because chamber pieces always tend to have a rough go of it on Broadway in general and don't always transfer even if they're universally beloved because of that reason. Also, it did finally open on Broadway a few months ago at the Vivian Beaumont Theater at Lincoln Center, and reviews have been all over the place. And it definitely like took some time to win me over as a show, but it does stick in your head in a weird way that I can't quite describe, that I think is part of why it is so beloved, even if anything beyond the cast album is not in the public eye very often. When I went to see the original production at the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts, semi-regular reminder to go support your local libraries, the thing that stuck out to me most is I've truly never seen a taped show with as much enthusiastic audience applause and engagement in a show before. It was genuinely bizarre, and I noted it 3 separate times in my notes, because like never in my dozen or so trips there have I heard on tape somebody yell bravo at the end of a song, and I think it happened more than once. I wrote down several different times like, this audience is just electric, and you can tell that from a tape that always feels inherently clinical. So since then, I've been really interested in the differing audience reactions to what I saw there and how people talk about the show to this revival? heavily delayed transfer of the show because of how the original production is discussed. And I think that I've narrowed it down to being 3 factors. First thing, Adam Guettel is an incredible composer. And also, and I say this as a compliment, he doesn't write the most easily initially accessible scores, very similar to how like Sondheim shows kind of require a second listen to the music to have it feel more like it musically makes sense or you can follow where it's going. That's personally something I'm really into. I like scores that are weird or different or really make my brain think in a musical direction. But for many people that can feel boring or jarring because the songs aren't initially predictable. And a show that requires a second viewing to be understood is going to inherently have a bit of an uphill battle ahead of it. I mean, I didn't really like Sweeney Todd at first, the first time around that I saw the show for this same reason, but then I ended up making an analysis long enough to rival the runtime of the show itself, because once I understood it, I became really interested in it and really dove in head first. Another example of a show like this that I think matches Floyd more in vibe, I've been kind of describing it to people as being Hadestown-esque, where like most people I know who didn't already love the Hadestown music before seeing Hadestown didn't quite get it the first time around, but word of mouth for that show is so strong that a lot of people, including myself, gave it a second try and then adored it. And that show had time for positive word of mouth around it to grow because it had a few workshops and productions and whatnot recently, recently right before it moved to Broadway. And obviously like anything Sondheim has a long runway of time for its word of mouth to build up too. So I was like, oh, I didn't quite like this, but everybody else seems to adore it, so I want to give it a second chance. Whereas Floyd has positive word of mouth from, hurts me to say 30 years ago, but that is how numbers work, so that also automatically is going to make things a bit difficult for the show in trying to find its audience and survive and thrive. The second thing is, you would think by the fact that it's a show about a dude who's trapped in a cave, it would be pretty heavy on the action and the urgency, and this show is like super calm. It's like a reflective character study of how different people react to such a high stakes situation and all of the local and national politics tied into this event. And for me, as somebody who's incredibly familiar with the ins and outs of search and rescues, they're a lot more tedious and boring and like mundanely stressful than what you would imagine from an action movie or something like that. So to me, the show perfectly encapsulates the situation and how it probably felt. And I was honestly really excited about seeing an authentic star on stage. Like, when are we gonna get that? But I do think, based on the like one sentence description of the show and thus what people are expecting walking into it, most audiences come in expecting some adrenaline, which you don't really get from this show. So then it can feel boring or slow because you're coming in with that expectation and then that's not what you're getting. The third factor is that the Vivian Beaumont stage is ginormous, and the staging and set used on top of the stage for this is pretty sparse, especially for a chamber piece musical about a claustrophobic situation. And this choice made a lot more sense to me after seeing the original production because the staging and lighting cues and choreography and just about everything are almost identical between the two productions. I noted maybe 5 to 10 minor differences, like there's like a handful of things that happen on the opposite side of this stage. Though Floyd is on the same side in both productions, the occasional use of projections is added for this instead of similar lighting cues that existed in the original. A handful of the costumes are different. Some of the lines are slightly changed. I think I didn't have my script on me for either version to be able to cross-check that. And the song It Moves got relocated to Act 2. But all in all, it just kind of feels like a copy-paste of the original onto a new stage. And I'm not inherently against that. I actually think that's really fine and cool and interesting. But I do think it brings up like interesting questions about whether a remounting of a show should change things or reimagine things, especially because there are some theater technology upgrade choices made here and many others that were not made here, which I thought was interesting to see like which choices they did make and they didn't make based on how technology has changed over the last 30 years. And we talked about this conundrum a bit with Tommy because the Tommy revival was also almost identical to the original production, but this case is even more complicated because while for the Tonys it's technically a revival, it is functionally just a delayed Broadway transfer. So then that complicates that question even further. But I do think that while Lincoln Center is one of the few theaters that can afford to risk an investment into a more oddball sort of show, perhaps this maybe wasn't the right place for an intimate chamber piece overall, especially not if they intended to have the same staging as the original, because the Vivian Beaumont stage could probably eat like 5 or 6 Playwrights Horizon stages, I would guess. So I do wonder a bit if the show would have gotten better reviews if it had been at the Todd Hames, mounted by Roundabout. Like they did Violet, which is a similar vibe, and it was very successful there, or the Samuel J. Friedman Theater mounted by MTC instead, because both of those theaters are a lot smaller and they can afford monetarily to take a risk like that because of how their funding works. But I also think that because the reputation of the show precedes it, people came in with different expectations that also hurt them a little bit because small chamber things are always inherently hit or miss for audiences. That's just how they function. And like, I personally didn't feel super detached from the show or feel like it was too sparse. The 2 times I've seen it have been from the 5th row and then from the 2nd row. Let me put the bows on screen for a hot second to prove that that is where I sat It was really great. I was right there. Anyway, they enter through what are functionally aisles from the audience, so I was somewhat immersed in it both times. And I do think the sparseness of the design gives more space for the music to tell the story and for it to feel like a character study because you're focused just on the people. Not to mention that the book-ended cave echo moments just feel incredibly beautifully grandiose in that space. But I do think that had I sat a lot farther back, especially before I had a connection to the show and understanding of the show, like just the first time that I sat through it, I would have felt a lot more detached from the story. But either way, I do highly recommend going to see it if you do have the chance. If you're between 18 and 35 years old, you can get $30 tickets on LinkTix if you make a free account. They also have a $49 lottery, and TDF, which has lots of different membership qualifications, so you probably qualify, their membership is $42 a year, and then Broadway shows are on there for $59. So there's a lot of more accessible ways to see it before it closes on June 22nd. And I highly recommend it. Even if it's not, quite your jam, it will expand your view of the genre of musical theater in a cool way, which is something I'm always a fan of and always encouraging. Also, the music is just gorgeous, but I might recommend listening to at least some of it before you go in, because that might help it be a little bit easier of an experience if you struggle with accessibility of music, if that makes any sense at all whatsoever. I should also mention that this production was nominated for 6 Tony Awards. Jeremy Jordan for leading actor, he plays Floyd. Taylor Trench for featured actor, he plays Skeets Miller. I'm still thinking about his performance weeks later. He's incredible. The role itself is incredible. We'll talk about that. And then best lighting, best sound, best orchestrations, and best revival. So we will see how that goes in the 2 weeks from now is when the Tonys are. 1 week from now? When this video comes out, I think? I don't know. Anyway, let's begin with the plot summary. The show begins with the Ballad of Floyd Collins, a song where the characters introduce the situation. It is winter of 1925. We are in Kentucky cave country where a smart caver named Floyd is going to search for his fortune under the ground. And I'm going to keep my historical commentary for later, but I will just briefly say there is a historical Ballad of Floyd Collins folk song. This is not the same tune or lyrics as that one, but it has a very similar vibe to it, so it feels like a nice nod to it in a way that I quite enjoy. But we'll talk about the rest of the historical stuff a bit later. We then meet our protagonist, Floyd Collins, as he finds and explores a new cave that he calls the Great Sand Cave, and imagines how he's going to set it up and what it's going to look like, and how he's finally going to make the family proud and prove to his dad that caving isn't a waste of time. And in the song, he plays with his echo and yodels along with it in a way that is both gorgeous and also must have been so technically unbelievable to an audience in the 1990s. It still feels technically incredible today. Also, side note, I know how to mix audio like that, but I don't know how to do that live, and I have like a gazillion logistical questions as to how that mechanically the song works, even if it is mixed live. I'm assuming it is not a recording and it is mixed live based on how the vocals function. But anyway, if you have any answers on that, please enlighten me in the comments. I'm simply dying to know, and it will help me sleep at night. Anyway, as he sings about these things, he climbs through the cave, wiggling through tight squeezes, he's scaling walls, he's rappelling down on a rope with a single lantern, and on his way back out of the cave for the day, his lantern falls and goes out, and so he tries to squeeze through the hardest part in the dark, but accidentally loosens up some rocks, one of which pins his leg down, and then his arms get trapped in the squeezed passageway. So he lays there, trapped in the dark, hoping that somebody's gonna come and find him. He's located on stage right, so it's the left side for the audience, in a sort of chair-like situation, which is actually more or less the angle that Floyd would have been in real life, stuck for the entirety of the show. So if you are choosing which side to buy tickets on, I will say the left side of the audience is going to be more the move. The next day, the men on the surface see that his jacket is left at the opening of the cave. They assume that he's gotten himself into a scrape, but overall everybody's pretty chill about it. Floyd is lucky. He gets out of all situations. Nobody's really worried that much. His family, a dad named Lee, stepmom named Miss Jane, and sister named Nellie come to the cave to ask what's going on, but nobody puts in a lot of urgent effort to do anything. Homer, Floyd's brother, runs in shortly after he'd been in town buying a Model T and immediately goes down into the cave to see what the situation is. Miss Jane is incredibly nervous because Floyd had recently told her about a dream that he had where he died in a cave, but Nellie sings to her about how Floyd's got the luck, so everything is going to be just fine. Homer, upon reaching Floyd, realizes that the situation is pretty bad and spends the night with him to try to calm him down a little bit in the cave, and then the rest of the locals kind of start to finally begin to worry a little bit. A reporter named William Burke Miller, known as Skeets because of his mosquito-like size, arrives on the scene and asks Homer some questions about Floyd, to which Homer exhaustingly tells him, if you care so much, you should just go ask him. So Skeets goes and climbs into the cave. He's never been in a cave before. This is a deeply traumatic experience for him, but he does it anyway. Turns out he's the only one who's small enough to get all the way down to him, so he brings him some food and some drink, and he interviews him for the paper, and they develop a friendship over the course of this rescue mission. Skeets' story then gets picked up and broadcast across the country, leading more and more reporters to steadily show up. Skeets focuses his energy on the rescue mission, helping with the first release plan, which is come up with by an engineer named H.T. Carmichael, who seems to prefer his own opinions on how to handle the situation to those of the locals individuals who actually know something about caves, which involves Skeets tying a harness around Floyd's upper body and then a team pulling on the rope as hard as they possibly can. This obviously causes immense pain and starts to potentially maybe tear Floyd's foot off, so they give up on this plan and try to come up with another one, and Floyd is starting to get really worried and having the occasional moment of like incoherence or confusion as he struggles with the circumstances and is also like losing energy, and hypothermia is a thing, and you know, all of the things about being stuck in a cave underground. On the surface, everybody else is also starting to get a little bit more worried, and Lee sings a song with Miss Jane about how all of his children are a bit of a mess and what did he do wrong as a father and how did this happen, and Miss Jane kind of comforts him, and then Homer goes back down and works on digging out portions of the passageway while entertaining his brother with various riddles. After intermission, the news story continues to just expand and spiral completely out of control, with reporters making up things and turning the locals into interesting specimens rather than real people. And then on Sunday, people travel from all over the country to the property to play carnival games and get balloons and buy souvenirs while they wait for Floyd's eventual rescue. This is known as Carnival Sunday. And it feels almost poetic, and like Floyd dreams in the opening song of having souvenir shops and refreshment stands and all of these things at his great cave, and those things do happen, if only temporarily, and not at all how he'd imagined, nor does he get to actually enjoy them. Skeets climbs down with a crowbar and a jack to work the rock off of Floyd's foot, and they do start to make progress, but the tools are then dropped and thus lost. But Skeets hopes to return the next day with a new crowbar and a new jack when he's rested and try to give it another go, but Floyd tells him to kiss him goodbye, and then as Skeets leaves, there's a passageway collapse that cuts Floyd off from outside contact altogether, which they're not able to regain. Carmichael closes off the cave entrance to everybody and has his men dig a giant shaft to get down to Floyd, but it is arduous work and likely will not be done in time to save Floyd. Nellie gets incredibly upset that she isn't allowed in the cave. She sings about how she wishes that she could free her brother, and Homer tries to fight Carmichael to use more like logical methods because he knows that they're running out of time to get to his brother. And then he also gets into a fight with his father over the fact that like the dad had no problem selling Floyd's pictures and profiting off of all of this, and is now saying that maybe it is God's will for Floyd to die down there, and everybody begins to lose hope. Skeets goes into the shaft and continues digging, apologizing for turning Floyd into a story and trying his very hardest to get to him before time runs out. Meanwhile, Floyd, in and out of consciousness at this point, thinks he hears Nellie's voice in the wind, as he has been throughout his time down there. She's kind of his like guiding light. While he's struggling with all this, he constantly is having mental conversations with her and everything, and he dreams about being free and riding in the new Model T with her and Homer, and of showing off this great sand cave with all of her beauty, and we see all of this joy, and then we're pulled right back out of it with the reminder that he is still trapped, and Nellie tells him that it's time to let go. So he sings about what heaven will be like, about what it will be like to meet his mother there, and then he sings with his echo one last time as his spirit walks off into the sunrise. Now, the first thing that I need to commend the creative team on is how incredible of an adaptation this musical is of Trapped, which is the book that it based its version of events on. This book is also the most firm and thorough source on what actually happened. We'll get to that situation in a moment. It is just so unbelievably well done. Like, there are many times when I read the real history behind shows or films and I sort of look at it like squinty-eyed and sideways trying to figure out how they got from point A to point B. But here it was just like, oh, they put the book on stage almost identically, with the exception of like they condensed a couple things, they combined a handful of real people to make the story clearer, they turned Nellie into like a character to give Floyd a stronger motivation. They also moved like 3 or 4 dates around, but so many of these things that the first time around I assumed were altered for storytelling purposes because they made such a good story were just things that actually genuinely happened, and I think that's really cool in and of itself. Seeing the show, knowing the full history the second time, felt like an Easter egg hunt of sorts, of like all these smaller details they decided to include and definitely did not have to, but did anyway, which was just incredibly cool and beautiful to me. Also, the book is really good. There's an audiobook available, it's on Audible, so definitely worth the read if you have the time. It's a really great time. But with that, let's dive into the actual history here. So in the region of Kentucky where Floyd Collins lived, cave country, the land was on top of limestone bedrock, which is something that under the right conditions makes for pretty garbage farming and pretty great caves. And if you set up your cave right with trails and easy entry and souvenir shops and refreshment stands and ticketed entry and all of that, you can make a great deal of money off of them. So many people in the region would spend their winters searching for new caves to turn into tourist spots, and then their summers working in the already existing caves. So if you're like, why the heck did this man decide to go explore this cave in the wintertime? What is he doing? That's why that happened. And this had been the case in that area for a very long time. Mammoth Cave specifically had been famous to US settlers for over 100 years, if not more than that at this point. Obviously, Mammoth Cave was known of well before this time. Many of the caves in the region have Native American artifacts in them, and these caves have extensive history way before the colonizers ever discovered them. But in the sense of using them for tourist purposes, that had been around for quite some time. Most of the early tour guides and explorers of Mammoth Cave were enslaved men, with Stephen Bishop being the most famous. His maps of the cave are unbelievably accurate given the level of tools he very much did not have at the time. And Mammoth Cave became a very popular stagecoach stop between Louisville and Nashville. And in fact, Jenny Lind visited the cave on her tour through the United States with P.T. Barnum in 1851. And while we don't know for sure whether or not she sang in there during her visit, musician to musician, I can almost guarantee you that she did. But we'll talk more about her in a couple videos. I just thought that was a fun fact to bring in. But because this area had so much visitor traffic and the farmland was so terrible, everybody kind of wanted to cash in on the resources that were available underground, and thus what became known as the Kentucky Cave Wars began, with people doing all kinds of things to direct tourist traffic to their own personal caves. People called cappers because of the hats that they wore, hired by various cave companies, would stand by the roadway and claim to have official information and send visitors to the cave at which they were employed. People would do hoaxes and publicity stunts. They would put up signs to confuse patrons into going to their caves, whatever it took to make a buck. And things got even worse when George Morrison found a different entrance to Mammoth Cave and started marketing it as Mammoth Cave, confusing tourists even further, and the court did rule that it was legal for him to use that name because technically it was Mammoth Cave. So then there was also a race to try to find other entrances to Mammoth Cave because that had serious name recognition. The cave wars climaxed in the 1920s when there were over 20 caves open to the public in this region, but the wars would continue to some degree well into the 1950s. William Collins Floyd was born in 1887 and became the eldest of at least 6. Another source I read says one of 9. I can only find records of 7 siblings. In 1922, when his older brother James passed away, and his mother also died in 1915, and so his father remarried a woman known locally as Miss Jane, who was the widow of a caver. Speaking of her, the dream that I talked about earlier that is in the show that she and Nellie discuss, where supposedly Floyd dreamt that he died in a cave, that dream did actually happen, but it was Miss Jane that had it a couple days before he got stuck, not Floyd. They switched that, which I think was logical. Anyway, there are so many pieces of the story that remind me of how interesting real life actually is, but that's beside the point. Floyd was functionally uneducated and he worked on the family farm as well as cutting timber for railroad ties, but he was also an unbelievably experienced caver and knew a lot about rocks, beginning his cave exploration at the age of 6 years old. Trapt describes him as being a daredevil who was seemingly unconcerned with danger and not always of the most sound judgment, but he was incredibly smart and man did he know his caves. Floyd was a bit of a loner. He didn't talk to people very much, never really showed interest in the ladies. He much preferred to put a can or two of beans into his pocket and jump into a hole somewhere to go exploring for days at a time and then pop out of a different one. Often by himself, but also he sometimes brought his siblings, especially Homer, as well as his caving friend Johnny Gerald. Remember those names for later. And Floyd's father thought this was a massive waste of time and very much disapproved of it, but at the same time probably couldn't deny the money to be made by a chance encounter with discovering a big cave in a logical spot. But in 1917, Floyd discovered a cave beneath his father's farmland that they called Crystal Cave, later called Floyd Collins Crystal Cave, that they turned into a tourist destination. He worked as both a guide and a capper here, but the issue is this cave was so far out of the way that the other cappers and the various road signs and all that kind of stuff had gotten the majority of visitors to go to other caves before they managed to get to the Collins Cave, so it wasn't really the most financially viable of ventures, leading Floyd to continue searching for a better located cave. In January of 1925, at the age of 37, and now with over 3 decades of caving experience and almost exactly 100 years ago today, Floyd entered a contract with B. Doyle and Ed Estes to split the profits of what was named Sand Cave on Doyle's property, which was right along the highway to Mammoth Cave. Floyd spent about 3 weeks working on enlarging the pathway to get down to what he assumed was a big cavern underneath, and on the morning of January 30th, he went out as he had been every day to continue working on this cave, but on his way out of the area that he had been working on, his lamp died and he tried to continue climbing out in the dark as he'd done many times before, but a 27-pound rock got dislodged and pinned his ankle in place, and he ended up with his arms pinned by his sides as well. This location was about 150 feet in through the passageway for the mouth of the cave and about 55 to 60 feet straight down to the ground. I'm gonna put 2 slightly blurry drawn diagrams up on the screen for a hot second so you can see what that looked like. Please look away if you don't want to think about that. Okay, all done with cave images, I promise. So since Floyd was by himself and was known for wandering off for days at a time, people didn't really start to worry that something might be like wrong until about 25 hours into him being gone. They noticed that he didn't come home that night and they were like, that's weird, but they didn't quite start panicking that maybe something was wrong for a little bit of time. And the first person to climb down to try to reach him was 17-year-old Jewel Estes, the son of Ed Estes, and the only one small enough to fit through the extremely narrow sections of the cave. He panicked and turned back near the end of the trek, but he called Floyd's name and got a response, so they knew that he was down there. Floyd's brothers Homer and Marshall joined in the rescue efforts, and several other local cavers tried to get down to Floyd, but most of them turned back early, saying there was no way they could get through and that it was an absolute death trap, and refused to go back in a second time, which made them really short on men really quickly. A reporter by the name of William Burke Skeets Miller arrived on February 2nd, 3 days into Floyd's entrapment, and he was not the first reporter to arrive on the scene, but he was in the first handful and would of course become the most famous. Miller was 5'5", he was a redhead, and he was 21 years old, and described as not much bigger than a mosquito, which is how he got his nickname, and he did in fact dream of being a baritone on the operatic stage. That is true, but he'd recently taken a job writing for the Louisville Courier-Journal, and he had never been into a cave before, but when he was told to go ask Floyd for himself rather than asking everybody else questions about Floyd, Skeets just decided to go and climb in, and he would go in many times over the course of the rescue efforts and help lead them because he was one of the few people who was small enough to fit through the smallest passageways, and of course one of the only people who was willing to go back down a second time. He recorded what the cave looked like, what it was like to be in there, what he experienced trying to get into it and get out of it. He wrote down Floyd's thoughts and how Floyd reacted to everything. And overall, Floyd was often trying to keep the rescuers in good spirits and telling them to go rest up and take care of themselves and not to worry, being way more patient than I can even fathom. But he also, of course, had his moments where that broke and the terror and the impatience took over. He also often switched, especially later, between fully lucid and just very, very disoriented. And honestly, this musical does a really great job of balancing all of those different things, and the general order and frequency at which they came feels kind of accurate to how hypothermia and other things work, as well as exhaustion and everything else. That day was also the day they attempted the harness thing to free him, which was immensely painful, as one would expect. The idea for this actually came from Louisville firefighter named Lieutenant Robert Burden, who was combined with Henry Carmichael, General Superintendent of Kentucky Rock Asphalt Company, to create the Carmichael character in the show. Basically, any not local caver who showed up with some idea on how to free Floyd that showed more hubris and desire for the fame of being the one that saved the guy, rather than like any deference to the knowledge of how caves actually work, was combined to create the Carmichael character. But there were many different people who had those opinions and who showed up and kind of wreaked a little bit of havoc. Disagreements on rescue efforts between the locals and the outsiders were a very strong issue throughout the entire rescue attempt, and only continued to get worse as time goes on. Johnny Gerald, Floyd's caving friend, also arrived on the scene around this time. Johnny had the most like head-to-head arguments with the outsiders on the caving mission because he was often treated as the head of the local rescue team, and the media chose to frame him as being some sort of like villain who's jealous of Floyd and has ulterior motives. And Gerald, Homer, and Marshall are all combined to create Homer Collins' character in the musical. Now, on February 3rd, the National Guard arrives to help keep order, and troops would continue to arrive to help organize the situation for the rest of the time. A first aid tent is also set up around this time as well to take care of the various rescuers, and a string of lights is set up to give Floyd the ability to see, as well as to give him some heat from the light bulb to try to keep him warm. And this is the day that the Floyd Collins news story becomes the top story in the nation, pushing the then leading story about a dog named Balto and a diphtheria outbreak in Nome, Alaska into second place, and becoming one of the first national media events. The Floyd Collins saga was also the first non-political news story to be broadcast via radio, and it ended up becoming the third biggest media event between the world wars. The first two media events would of course both involve Charles Lindbergh, who actually, before he became famous, flew Floyd Collins related news and film to Chicago from Kentucky. But the thing about this media frenzy was that everybody wanted to have the exciting story, even though every single journalist was reporting on it. So journalists started to embellish events or just completely make things up altogether. They gave Floyd a fake sweetheart who was a real girl who'd never really interacted with Floyd before. They wrote about a loyal dog waiting for him at the edge of the cave. They started these countdowns of like, oh, if he's not reached by this time, he's gonna die, or he has this many hours left. It's not like we do that anymore in the news with various crises about people being stuck in places. They also created rumors that this was all a hoax as part of the cave wars. Floyd isn't really down there, or he is actually down there, but he comes out in secret every night and then he goes back the next day, or somebody had murdered him and placed him down there. All of these kinds of rumors just continue to spiral out of control. And this is the primary reason that the historical record of what actually happened and when this stuff actually happened is so deeply wonky and inconsistent. But Trapped does a really good job of cutting through the noise and figuring out what did and did not happen and constructing a more concrete timeline. But even to this day, a lot of the media retellings of this story are just factually disasters, which I think is also part of why I'm so impressed by how factual this musical is, because you would expect, based on how culturally we understand the story, that that would not at all be the case. On February 4th, there were 2 separate collapses that cut Floyd off completely from the rescuers, so they were no longer able to bring him food or drink. The following day, all locals are kicked out of the rescue area, and Lieutenant General Denhart, also combined to create Carmichael in the show, leads the construction of the shaft. And they initially try to use modern equipment to do it because it'll be faster, but they worry about the exhaust suffocating Floyd, so they resort to using just hand tools. But unfortunately, the weather takes a turn for the worse, with just constant torrential rain causing the shaft to have very sketchy structural integrity, so they have to constantly add in supports. And if I remember correctly, they were also having to dig from a platform for extra safety to prevent collapse and constantly scooping out water from the shaft, which made progress frustratingly slow. That being said, Denhart did work his men very smartly, and nobody got seriously injured and nobody died in this process, and they were all taken as well care of as was possible in the situation, which is unbelievably impressive. On Sunday, February 8th, a week and 2 days after Floyd's entrapment and 4 days after he's cut off from the rest of the world, is known as Carnival Sunday. Yes, that did really happen. On this day, about 10,000 tourists made their way to Sand Cave, where people set up food carts and there was a juggler and balloons and entertainment. It was overall a fairly joyous occasion for a lot of people who visited, despite the obvious situation at hand and the people working on the rescue knowing that at this point it might be a bit of a lost cause. On February 11th, the torrential rain starts to turn to snow. The shaft digging still continues ever so slowly. It finally breaks through on February 16th, which is 17 days after the rescue efforts first began, and they do find Floyd, but he had been dead, ruled due to exposure, exhaustion, and starvation for probably about 3 days, dying probably on Friday, February 13th. They decided that it was probably too much of a risk to try to take him out, so they filled in the shaft and they left him there. After Floyd's death, Skeets Miller would be offered an unfathomable amount of money to travel on a lecture circuit to talk about his experiences, but he declined that and returned to his reporting job at the Courier-Journal. He would become one of the youngest Pulitzer Prize winners in history for his reporting on this story. Homer did go on a vaudeville tour since he was offered a contract, and he used that to raise money to be able to get his brother out of the cave, whose body was brought out of the cave on the 23rd of April that year and buried on the family farm. Now, Lee Collins would sell Floyd's Crystal Cave to a buyer with the agreement, much to the rest of the family's horror, that Floyd's body could be on display in that cave. So that happened in 1927, I believe, and then the body was stolen in 1929, later found in a bush missing a leg, and then put back into the cave for viewing. And this very well might have been a publicity stunt. That still remains a bit murky, but Floyd would remain in that cave until the National Park Service purchased it in 1961, and his remaining family finally put him to rest in a cemetery in March of 1989. And while the initial Floyd situation was good for cave business and that it brought a lot of people to the area, it did obviously create a huge slump in tourism as people began to question the safety of caves. There was also increasing concern around the competition of the cave wars and how that encouraged reckless endangerment because people were trying to find more caves, with worries that this would not become an isolated event, gaining the National Park Service some traction on turning cave country into an official park so they could control who could go into these caves and where they could do so, and Mammoth Cave National Park was established in 1941. Floyd's legacy continues to live on. A lot of the caving security measures that exist today are because of this event, as well as a new knowledge of how important speed and organization are in emergency situations, something that this attempted rescue mission was severely lacking. It was a disorganized disaster. The Collins homestead would become the first headquarters of the Cave Research Foundation. Cave explorers continued to find leftover bean cans and rocks inscribed with Floyd or simply an F in caves in that area for decades to follow. And in 1972, surveyors would discover that the Mammoth Cave Ridge and Flint Ridge cave systems were interconnected, just as Floyd had suspected. And I think it's easy to just go, oh, this dude wasn't smart, so he died in a cave. But the fact that he spent over 30 years as a caver, and this was the first, major scrape, at least as far as we know, that he got into, is incredibly impressive. He knew these rocks, he knew these systems, he was truly one of the greatest cave explorers of all time, and I think it's important that we remember that about him, rather than just oh, he's the dude that got stuck in a cave, because I don't think that's super fair to his memory or his legacy. The one thing I did note in my last trip to see the show was that many of the small handful of historical inconsistencies in the show that I'm not mad about, and I could probably count how many there are in one hand, sort of feel like gifts to the actual Floyd, if that makes any sense. The first one that popped out to me is that this happened during Prohibition, and Floyd, when stuck, asked for what I want to say was whiskey. It might have been a different alcohol I did specifically write it down. I'm gonna say that it was whiskey. And he never got that because it was confiscated before he could have that brought down to him. But in the show, this argument about it being contraband is had, but Homer gets him the whiskey anyway. The Floyd in the show also gets to have his entire family there waiting for him near the beginning of it all, and Homer is the first one to get down to him, unlike how many of his family and friends did not show up until many days after he was initially stuck, and Miss Jane and Nellie didn't arrive until about a week or so into it, and Homer wasn't able to get within like shouting distance of him for quite some time because he wasn't able to fit. And Floyd also gets a huge, dreamy, perfect cave at the bottom of this when, at least as far as is currently known, Sand Cave has been heavily closed off because even to today it's seen as a death trap. There was no great, beautiful cavern down there for him to reasonably be able to turn into anything. Again, as far as we know. There could be one down there. We're not going to find out. That's not a place that should be explored. Editing Sydney here. I can't remember in the book if it said that they know this because, like, they looked into it, or if they used the technology that we have available to check that there's no cavern down there, and in which case, if they did check that, then obviously we know, and if they didn't, that we don't. I think the book could have potentially been published before that technology was made available. I'm not quite sure what that whole situation is, because that is where my geological knowledge ends, but I think there's no cave. So that's what we're gonna go with. In real life, he actually only mentioned a great cave being there to Skeets, presumably hoping that he would report on it to get them some business if he did later find a big cavern down there, but he didn't seem to talk to anybody else about what he was seeing down there at all. And also in the show, they had Skeets find him right around the time that he dies, so he doesn't die entirely alone. And like, while most of these things needed to be there for narrative exposition or for tension purpose, it still was kind of heartwarming to me that at least this Floyd got to have those small things, even if the real one didn't. I don't know, that just means something to me for some reason. The reason I made this video, going to the actual topic at hand, is because I wanted to learn more about Nellie Collins. There's a small handful of lines that mention her recent return from a mental institution and is not otherwise addressed any further, which I think is more or less fine. We're gonna get to the narrative conversation in a moment, but since she is a real historical figure, I did want to know, like, what information is there about her life? Like, I am curious. I want to know, primarily because somebody returning from a mental institution is not unheard of in this era, but it's also incredibly uncommon given that institutions were not places of rehabilitation and often patients got worse during their time there, something that wasn't formally studied until the 1940s and 1950s. So I went home, I acquired the Trapped audiobook, and I began to work my way through it, hoping to learn more about this Nellie, but she's only mentioned 4 times. The first time, they note that she had a history of mental illness and just returned from a 6-month stay at an asylum in Hopkinsville. The second time, they mentioned that Nellie and Miss Jane didn't go to the cave until around a week into the attempted rescue process and neither handled it super well. And then the final 2 times are in the epilogue section, mentioning that Nellie brought and testified in a lawsuit against American Legion in response to their deeply misinformed 1964 article on the Floyd Collins affair. Don't read it. I did, and I was like, this doesn't make any sense. That's why it didn't make any sense. None of it was true. But she was awarded some money in damages, and also that she was married with no children. She was always in precarious mental health, and she lived in Louisville, not far from Homer, later in her life. Now, the show mentioned that she was at Greenhaven Mental Institution. I somehow forgot the Hopkinsville tidbit for some of this research process, so I didn't look there first, but the only Greenhaven institution in Kentucky was a private school for adults and children with developmental disabilities that opened after the Floyd Collins affair, so it seems like this was something the creative team made up to sound like a fancy mental institution. They did live like on the Green River, so it kind of makes sense that that's, you know, what they would go with in trying to create something fictional. But at the time, there were only 3 major institutions in Kentucky: Eastern State Hospital, Western State Hospital, and Central State Hospital, all 3 of which were public institutions, meaning that patients did not have to pay to be at these institutions to get care, but paying patients would have better accommodations and better care. I have a history of institutions. I will link it above if you want to learn about them. That also includes a history of the modern institutions and how they still exist. But public asylums became very overcrowded very quickly because so many people were coming into them, and very few, if any, were ever actually leaving them. Western State Hospital was located in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, so that is likely where Nellie was for those 6 months, and it was built in the late 1800s in the traditional Kirkbride style. Kirkbride was a pretty cool guy, actually. He created the precursor to the American Psychiatric Association, and he designed how his institution should be run, often like little cities, giving the patients jobs and having things like hair salons and bowling alleys and as much open space and air and nature and farmland as possible. Obviously, unpaid labor, really bad. But the idea of giving people something to do rather than just warehousing them and keeping them like unconscious and chained up was incredibly important, and not something that stayed as an idea for very long. The only problem is that each Kirkbride building was usually built to hold no more than about 250 patients, and each state only had a handful of these institutions, so by the time that Nellie got to Western State Hospital, it likely had well over 1,500 patients. Nellie was also in the mental health care system in the time frame when involuntary sterilization became quite common. Buck v. Bell, the Supreme Court case that made involuntary sterilization definitively legal and has yet to be overturned was in 1927, but the first sterilization law appeared in 1907 and became more common in the South first, particularly in Virginia, which has formally apologized for that since then. But a lot of areas of the South prioritized sterilization before it spread to the rest of the country. So there is a world where she did not have children later in life because she was made unable to do so, and I would unfortunately consider that to be more likely than not. Since Western State was horrifically overcrowded, if patients wanted any semblance of mental health care, the best option was going to be to pay for that care. I cannot find how much it would cost at the time. It's also very varied based on what care was needed. But there was a line in Trapped about Mr. Collins saying he had no money to pay for Floyd's attempted rescue because they had spent everything that they had on Nellie, so it seems like that's likely the route that they probably went with her. And she very well may have been discharged after the 6 months because the money ran out and they didn't want to enroll her as a public patient because of what the conditions look like, and so she came home. An article with the granddaughter of Floyd Collins' niece from 2023 mentioned that his sister Nellie Collins Leach was placed in a mental institution sometimes after his death, so there is a likelihood that she went back to that institution or a different one at a different time in her life, but the fact that both she and Homer settled in Louisville implies to me that she started going to Central State Hospital or some outpatient care in relation to that up there, because we know that she got married and she wasn't married at the time of Floyd Collins' death, and at the time of her death she was living in a non-medical building, because I did find her obituary. I'll also put the one image I found of her on the screen if you want to see what she looks like. So it's not that Floyd died and she was immediately put back into institution, never to be seen again, as that sentence kind of implies, but I don't know. At this point I was kind of on my way to tracking down her marriage records and the state hospital records. I do know how to find both of those things, but I decided to stop doing that because it started to feel a bit like I was unethically prying into the life of this woman who never asked to be a public figure and was probably deeply overwhelmed by that fact. And I would also assume that because she's only very briefly mentioned in various pieces about this event, that they didn't really want to talk about her all that much, which was culturally appropriate for the time. And there's also obviously a huge difference between finding out information independently to better understand a historical figure for personal reasons versus putting the information on the internet. So even if I were to go track down those records, I would not talk about that publicly. Not saying that I have, but if I were to play this role one day, I would probably go down to Kentucky and track down the mental health records because I'm curious, but I wouldn't make what I found public information. Anyway, I do feel I'm so warm. It is far too warm to be wearing a flannel right now. Oh my goodness. Anyway, I do feel like, from a historian perspective, that had she experienced something with a more like visible external presentation like epilepsy or disruptive hallucinations or something along those lines, that would likely have been mentioned just based on what things are usually said versus left unsaid historically, at least in my experience with reading a lot of historical texts on mental disability. Things that are specifically could be like, oh, this person has seizures specifically, or something along those lines that is externally represented, they will often try to turn into like, this is a medical issue, not this is a mental health issue. So if they're like, oh, she struggled with mental illness and are being really vague about that, it's probably something different. So I'm inclined to believe it was somewhere in what we would in the modern day called OCD or depression or severe anxiety or bipolar or an invisible developmental disability or anything vaguely in those categories. Obviously, this is complete conjecture, and I feel a bit weird guessing anyway because, again, we have little to no information available. But that's also complicated because, especially in, like, when it comes to playing this character on a stage, I think there should be some thought put into it, but then also speculating about real people is questionable, so there's a lot of ethical quandaries here. But I do think the show does a really strong job of sort of poking at the press and otherwise outsiders trying to turn Nellie into a caricature or a character because of her stay in the asylum, as well as how the locals treat her like she's fragile in both a sexist and ableist way. And I feel like the show almost wants to say she's not mad, she's just different, but they see it as madness because she's a girl, and that could be reading too much into it. But there is a line where she talks about how she and Floyd think the same way that sort of points to this, as well as Lee Collins' continuous commentary about how this children being crazy oddballs. And the thing that stuck out most to me, both from Trapped and from Homer's retelling events, is specifically how often Floyd is described as quiet and odd and keeping to himself and a daredevil to an almost alarming degree where he almost didn't seem to feel fear about things. Because at that point, my brain just replaced the image that it had of Floyd Collins with an image of Alex Honnold in overalls. If you don't know who I'm talking about, side tangent, there's a documentary, it's called Free Solo, you might have heard about it, you might have seen it at this point. It's about Alex Honnold. That movie came out around the time I used to be a rock climber, so that's why I know a lot about it. I think it's on Disney Plus if you want to watch it. But anyway, he's an incredible rock climber, one of the best of all time. He likes to climb really big rocks in the wild without any ropes, and that is called free soloing. And this specific one is about him climbing the face of El Cap, I want to say, without any ropes. I could be wrong, I haven't seen it in a hot minute. Anyway, the documentary frames him as odd and sort of a loner. They also do a brain scan and they find out that his amygdala under fires in response to fear stimuli. And that's obviously like a huge chicken or the egg situation because brains are very plastic. So like perhaps it adjusted to him liking to do this thing, or perhaps he likes to do this thing because his brain is like that. And there's also been a lot of like, since the documentary came out, there's been a lot of public speculation around autism with him, which feels icky to say the least. But it did make me think tangentially that if there were a guy historically who presented like Alex Honnold does, but cave version, he would be seen as odd and maybe a little bit reckless, where a girl with the exact same traits would be seen as clinically odd to a concerning degree and would be noted as such and probably criticized as such. At the end of the day, I don't think it entirely matters. Frankly, even if I was able to find those records, which I'm not going to Kentucky anytime soon, this was a time in history where approximately none of the mental diagnoses that existed are still in use today, or if they are, the words mean very different things. So we will probably never know, and I don't want to speculate too hard based on the limited information that we have. But I do just posit these few things as thoughts from an acting or staging perspective. And I also specifically think that an actor choosing to play Floyd like Alex Honnold would be an incredibly interesting characterization choice that I kind of want to see what that looks like. But when it comes to narrative, I do find myself stuck between the disability of it all versus the young woman of it all. Ooh, intersectionality. Because of course you're gonna have this innocent younger sister be the beacon of hope and light who looks up to him. She's 13 years younger than him in real life, so that very well may have been their relationship. But when you bring up the fact that she's also mentally disabled, is having her be this guiding light suddenly stereotypical? Does it diminish her to being a one-dimensional character or a trope? Especially in that she's narratively framed as practically a literal angel, more so in the second act. And like, that's not an issue per se, like I'm not bothered by it and how it's used in the show, I think it's fine. But it does raise some storytelling questions at the very least. And it becomes even more difficult because she's also the one character on the stage that we have approximately zero historical information about. So there is inherent depth in everybody else that if it didn't end up in the script can be pulled from history books to make that person come to life in a way that is fundamentally impossible for Nellie because we just don't have any information. I will say there's a couple like small side characters that don't have that much historical information or are conglomerations of a bunch of people, but those are side characters that don't need that level of depth in order to come across as full people on stage because that's not how their characters work. She's the only principal character that we don't have any historical information on, which puts the actress playing Nellie at a sort of disadvantage from a character work side because everybody else pretty much has the basis written out for them in a way that she doesn't. And I found that both the current Nellie played by Lizzie McAlpine and the original Nellie played by Teresa McCarthy both feel like somewhat ethereal creatures, and it's interesting because their vocal types also both feel that way in completely different directions, which I think is cool. But I'm like not inherently against the ethereal creature idea, but I do wonder if that interpretation sort of differentiates her from the rest of the characters in a way that almost makes her seem non-human, and not in like a weird quirky way, but in more of a narrative device or poetic symbol kind of way, which wouldn't really be an issue except for the fact that she's disabled, so then it becomes a conversation that we're having about whether that is an issue or not. I would also note that a lot of her lines in the show are non sequiturs that kind of only quite make complete sense to her, which can make organic delivery of those lines difficult for an actor because they're detached from the rest of these scene partners, and that also doesn't really contribute to character development as much as the way that the other characters speak and what they talk about does, which separates her even more. And that's not a bad thing. Her being distinctly odd totally makes sense and totally works, but it does contribute to this feeling of her being a little otherworldly at times in a way that makes her less grounded in the story, which I can't even really blame the text itself for because Nellie as a character literally comes from a different world as everybody else, and then on top of that they had to write and portray her to feel categorically different from everybody else, which makes it near impossible to perfectly tonally match her to the rest of the world that she is in. So then it becomes just a completely impossible situation. Can you tell that I'm working on a show that's an adaptation of historical events and people right now, and I'm coming up against this very conundrum. But I do wonder if small changes and even just the physicality could help to ground that a little bit more, like fidgeting or spacing out or paying attention to things that aren't the main action, or just like being off in her own little world a little bit more. Lizzie's Nellie is interestingly like the modern interpretation of how we modernly handle mental illness versus how we used to in the 90s, which I think is really interesting, and that she's more fidgety and in motion, as well as interacting with other people and is given things to do with her time, which I think helped a lot with that character. Editing Sydney, I'm back. I want to elaborate on the comment I just made about physicality and mental illness because I've never seen this written down before. This is just like an observation I've made over my time doing this kind of research. So I wanted to talk more about it. Basically, over time, I've seen a shift in how we demonstrate mental illness on stage. And it used to be with like unnatural stillness. That character would move Tommy's actually a weirdly great example of this, where he was like very still and like had a specific way that he moved and took up space. That is something that we see typical of older references to mental disability, and in more modern references, it's usually a lot more stimmy and a lot more physically in motion. And I think that this kind of relates to the stylistic changes that we've seen in theater, particularly with bodies and actors neutral over time, in that there is more of like a required stillness of actors that we see in the more modern style of theater that wasn't as constant and like existing in older theater as much. It did exist, but I've noticed a significant shift in my understanding of theater history, in a change in how we approach actors neutral. And so we expect stillness from our actors as the baseline now to a very, very strong degree. That's how training kind of drills it into you. And then if you do any motion on top of it, that is means something, but the motion is usually pretty minimal. So adding in stimming or something like that in a modern show usually implies something specific about a character, when in older times, I hate to say older times, about 30 years ago, but back then it was a lot more fluid, where most people were just kind of like existing as people and scratching and just being human people. And so to distinguish otherness, it became a weird sort of stillness, and that has changed over time, which I think is really interesting. I will say again that this isn't like always the case, and actors neutral has been a part of acting training for forever, and it's an ableist construct and a racist construct, and we won't get into that whole saga. You can read Carrie Sandal's paper about it if you want to know more about it. But specifically, a physicality that meant something historically used to be a lot bigger than what we expect now, because our visual aesthetics of a stage now, we have a lot more of like this stylistic. I think Hamilton in particular is a really great example of like, this is the way that these people take up space on stage that is expected, and that just isn't as strong in some older things. And so when we are differentiating bodies on stage and differentiating body minds on stage, it looks different today than it used to look back then. And I also can't help but wonder if this stylistic shift is a direct response to Curious Incident and how we staged what his functional difference was on stage. Because it generally did happen around that era, that I feel like at least I started to see this more stylistic movement choices being made in this direction in theater, but I could just be connecting a lot of dots that don't exist. That's also incredibly possible. If you want a really great historical show to watch this transition happen, I highly recommend watching every single Sweeney Todd that has ever happened over the course of the last 50 years? How long has that show been around? This is what happens when I talk without a script. But in following that one specifically, there's several mentally disabled characters in that show, and the way that their physicality changed across versions is very much in line with this tradition, for lack of a better way to put it. And actually, this has happened in the reverse in Wicked, where older Elphabas used to be very stimmy and used to be very, witchy with their hands, and we are now seeing them be a lot more still and a lot more stagnant, which I think is a really interesting shift. But anyway, I did just want to note that that is a consistent thing that has changed over time, so I do think that this is in line with that. I don't know how deliberate that was or not deliberate that was, and just like a shift with how directing and bodies have changed in the last 30 years on stage. But I do think that is somewhat tied into what Lizzie's physicality looks like versus Teresa's, and why that exists from a historian's perspective. I also think some physicality mirroring between Floyd and Ellie would also be really interesting if there was a desire to lean into that sexism of mental illness tone even further and show how similar the two of them really are. It's just that he's allowed to cope with his struggles as he pleases and she isn't, because it's less socially acceptable for her to do so. But then at the same time, I fully understand the directorial desire to just kind of throw away mention that the thing existed and otherwise not quite touch it, because there is little to no record of what actually did or did not happen with her. And I think, given the historical record and the time this musical was written, they did a fine job with it. I'm just curious to see what other interpretations might look like and how that might change the character or change the story a little bit. And I'm also interested in the more general questions around how we adapt history and blend in what are functionally real people with fictional characters, because they do come across differently. And I've noticed that before in many different ways in different pieces of media, not just in theater, but this is one that is particularly interesting to me because she both has that going for her and then needs to come across as weird on top of that, which just puts her in a really interesting narrative situation. Slightly selfishly, Nellie is absolutely going into my teeny tiny little list of dream roles, so perhaps I will experiment with this and other interpretations of her at some point in the future myself. But in the meantime, I hope that you've enjoyed this little deep dive into the show that has been occupying my mind for the last couple of weeks. Please take the chance to see it if you can. I highly recommend it. The show is incredibly accessibly staged with the exception of one singular lighting cue fairly early in Act 2. I have my accessibility review of the show linked in the description if you want or need it. And it's just a lovely time. I'm a very like claustrophobic person who's afraid of caves. I've had panic attacks in caves before. I don't go into caves anymore. But I didn't feel super anxious throughout the story, which was just a very pleasant surprise. So if that is a reason that you're avoiding it, it might still be worth a shot. But again, I might recommend listening to the music beforehand because it will make you appreciate it more live. And also it's interesting because the vocal tones of just about everybody in the new version are different than the original version, but they both elevate the material in completely different ways, and it's really interesting to be able to compare the two. Anyway, if you've seen Floyd Collins, let me know what you think, but either way, all comments and thoughts and everything are welcome in the section below. If you want to like or subscribe or join my Patreon to support me in all things I do here and all of the many more things I'm doing behind the scenes, I would really appreciate having you stick around. I love having you here. The link to my source list is also down there as well if you want to read any more about this event. Again, I highly recommend the book. It's really great. And yeah, as always, thank you for being here. Thank you for being, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.